Next, we're going to hear about GreenScore from David Early, who is a principal with the Planning Center DC&E, which is an interdisciplinary firm of scientists, designers, economists, and planners with several offices here in California. David's expertise is in smart growth, sustainable development. He's worked on a wide range of projects involving public participation, transportation environmental reviews, transit-oriented development. And he's really focused on helping communities achieve consensus in difficult development and conservation issues. He has a master's degree in both architecture and city planning from UC Berkeley, and his talk is entitled Using Geodesign to Create Livable, Healthy Communities. So please welcome David Early. David.
Well, thank you for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be here and to be able to talk about GreenScore, which is a tool that we've been developing in our office for the last year or two. And I've got the clicker here now, so that's good. Just to tell you a little bit about us, we got a great introduction there, thank you very much, but to say some of the same things again, we do think of ourselves as one of the Western US's preeminent planning and design firms. We have about 110 employees working throughout primarily the state of California and then into the Western US, and you can find us at planningcenter.com if you'd like to do that. We do community planning, urban design, landscape architecture. We're working on a number of the same projects that Will talked about, particularly in LA County, on some of the same issues. We do environmental review and environmental services, economic, school facilities plannings, and of course GIS and geodesign. And one of the things I say, and I'm sure many of you think this as well, doing GIS today is like saying, well, I can do Excel or I can do Microsoft Word. It's just a basic part of the work we do. It's really not a standalone service we offer, although we do offer it occasionally that way, but it really is just the fundamental tool to do the geodesign that we do and all the other work that we take part in. So GreenScore is a dynamic suite of proprietary tools that we've developed that we use for measuring and evaluating the sustainability of the built environment in all of the work we do. And we look at a whole series of diverse topics. I'm going to show them to you here. 11 different topics overall, and about 50 individual indicators that we've developed measures for, and where we have a methodology that moves them forward to go into an actual analysis that we can use on a project. So when we put a project together in our office, one of the first things we do is ask ourselves which indicators out of this suite are the ones that make the most sense for the project, for analysis, and then later for design itself in the geodesign process. And we then go through a 7-step process with that list of indicators. So we first identify the indicators or metrics that we're going to use. We then customize the methodology. We have a sort of off-the-shelf methodology for each of these, but we go and customize it for the project on which we're working. We then do we figure out the unit of analysis we're going to do. We collect the data we need, and then we actually do the analysis. Based on that analysis, again, we have off-the-shelf thresholds that we think we're looking at, but we will customize those to the project as well. And then in the end, we are able to summarize the findings, and we summarize them both indicator per indicator, but then also we can pull them together into a single set of scores, if you will, for an individual project or study area. I want to talk today about 4 sample analyses that we do among those 50 indicators to give you a sense of 4 of them. And then I'm going to talk also about 2 larger projects where we brought these indicators together to do analyses and geodesign on individual projects. So I'm going to start by talking about these 4. It was great to hear Will talking about park access, which will be one of the ones I cover as well. I'm also going to talk about the other 3 you see listed here. I'm going to start with tree canopy coverage. In this, what we're trying to do is find specific areas and corridors that lack overall canopy coverage. And so we're trying to figure out actually the percentage of coverage in a given acre amount of land. We do this using a hexagonal grid analysis. We overlay that onto LiDAR data that we are using, that we can use then to actually identify on a remote basis the tree coverage. And that then allows us to generate maps that show both where the greatest amount of tree coverage are, or in this case, individual if we look up here, these individual scarce areas, the lightest colors are areas without tree coverage, and then greater density is shown here. So we are able to provide for our clients a map of the areas where they might really want to come in and look at additional tree plantings. This map down here, the reason it's got so much gray is that this was actually done for LA County for the isolated pockets of unincorporated county land, and so all of this is the city of LA, and we didn't do the analysis there. We did it only for the county areas, which you see on these islands. So that's one of these. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Retail Food Environment Index, which we also have methodologies to calculate. You may be familiar with this metric. It's the amount of unhealthy food, typified by fast food and convenience stores, divided by the amount of healthier food access, which is grocery stores and farmers markets and produce stands. So we figure out those two amounts of outlets. We use data that's available from individual counties, the Department of Public Health, and things like Google databases that show businesses. We then go through and ground truth that, so we're sure that we actually have an accurate representation of all the stores. And then we do that mapping and division so that we're able then to show areas on a map that are more or less have better or worse food environments. And so here you see these ratios. The areas with the darkest colors are the areas that have the least amount of access, and then you have better access as you go down the scale. We're also, of course, able to quantify that in terms of numbers of where people have access to food. Third one I want to talk about is park access. Will's talked about that some already. We have a pretty similar methodology. We use Network Analyst to figure out the proximity, not just in a radius area, but actually as a person would walk to get within that half-mile area of where there truly is a park. We are able to then output maps like the one you see here that show in gray the areas that are within an appropriate walking distance, and then the colored areas are those areas that don't have access, and we differentiate those between the orange areas, which are places where people live, and the gray areas, which are non-residential areas and are hence of less concern, such as along these corridors. We come out with a map like this, and then we also then take that to get a more refined measure of park need, very similar to what ParkScore does, where we not only look at park access, although that's the most heavily weighted issue, but we also look at tree canopy coverage and food access that I already showed you, and we look at population density, which allows us then to come up with a composite map like this one that shows the area that has the highest park need, which is both an area with a low park access, but also a high amount of population and lower tree coverage and lower access to food. Fourth technique that I want to talk a little bit about is our development constraints mapping. This is actually an amalgamation of 8 separate indicators that I'll show you here. We take information about slopes and earthquakes, mining constraints, proximity to water lines, proximity to developed land, highways, major roads, the general plan designations, the presence of existing planning boundaries that allow for development, and the presence of sensitive species. And we're doing this analysis then for a large rural area to try and find out what are the areas that are most likely to be developable over time, so that we can then map for a client. In this case, it's San Bernardino County, an area, as many of you know, the largest county in the US, a good deal larger than several of our states. This is an area where tremendous growth pressures. We're in the county here today. We're way down in the corner here. And this is an area where we see tremendous growth pressure, and the county needs to know, well, where are the areas that will be developing? So we take all these layers, put them together, weight them, and then we're able to come out with what we call a heat map that shows those areas that are most likely to be developed when one takes all of these constraints into consideration. And so the areas shown in blue and green are areas that have already developed and are likely to see growth pressure in the future. As we move into the yellow areas, those are probably a little further out, and the reds and oranges are areas that we don't expect to develop within the foreseeable future of the planning horizon. So let me talk a little bit about how we use these in practice today. I'm going to talk about 2 projects that are right here in San Bernardino County. think locally. That's one of the things we like to do. So I'll talk a little bit about both of these projects here in San Bernardino County. Mark Hoffman from my office is here today, and he does a lot of our healthy planning work. He is based here in San Bernardino County with an office in Ontario, and he's been putting together a series of policy briefs under a project called the Healthy High Desert Environmental Scan, which looks at the health environment of the area just across the mountains here on the north side of the mountains in the high desert area of San Bernardino County. He's put together a series of policy papers, policy briefs. 2 of them are done already on parks and recreation and the retail food environment. He's going to be creating a 3rd one now also with geodesign techniques on public safety. And they are supported by a host of geospatial maps like the ones you see here that show, in this case, the park score or park proximity of people living in all these communities within the high desert area, and then the number who have access. And I think, Will, if you did the high desert community, you might get a score lower than Fresno's even. You can see that there are actually 36% of the population living out there has no access to parks at all, and only about 19% has what we describe as excellent access to parks. So it's a very telling analysis for the folks in this area, just like it is for the other communities that Will's been looking at. I want to also mention this developable land inventory and build-out analysis that we did for San Bernardino County as a whole. I already showed you the map that we did for the hotspots of development capacity. We merged that with a separate approach, which is a technique that allows us to figure out the ownership of land that's subject to the most development. So these are people, when you get this map, it's a little hard to read due to the colors, but these colored areas, in particular the darkest colored areas, are the lands in the end that we know to be owned by people who have a development interest. So we need to superimpose that interest in development with the physical capacity to absorb development. And that then allows us to come out with a composite map here that shows the pattern of land. These, again, the colored parcels are those which are somebody probably wants to develop them, and the color itself indicates the actual appropriateness for development. An interesting sort of historical artifact here is that checkerboard pattern results from the subdivision pattern that occurred with the railroads in the early part of the 19th century. That railroads got every other section on a checkerboard pattern. So the federal government controls the rest of those, and those are shown in white, and then the privately held parcels are the colored parts of the checkerboard, and that's why you see this pattern. But again, you see that the areas most heavily subject to development are in some of these existing urbanized communities and out this corridor here, with, despite the ownership pattern, looking for development, a much less appropriate development areas further afield. So that gives you a sense of some of the things we're doing. I tried to go through this briefly so we could have plenty of time for questions, but wanted just to sum up by saying what we're trying to do with GreenScore really is, we're very excited that Esri has come forward with this geodesign initiative, because we see what we're doing in GreenScore really as being geodesign, taking geographic space and considering it in its geographic context, both the social and environmental, essentially merging art and science so that we are able to do really meaningful analyses that we can bring forward to our planning and design clients as we move the discourse forward about what appropriate and sustainable development is. So thank you very much, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, David. Let's have a seat. Will? Thank you both. I was thinking, as I was listening to both of you, talking about using scores to move the marketplace in comparison to the talk we heard earlier about China, the kind of bottom-up versus top-down structure of our 2 different countries. So how effective have you seen these scores being in terms of moving the marketplace and in terms of getting change to happen? And are there any strategies? You've talked a little bit about getting the politicians in a competitive mode, but what about the market itself?
Well, I think you know, what we're seeing, for example, on the health side, if you look at a market there, we're looking, you know, Kaiser has been a major supporter of fitness zones. So I think the idea that if you get out ahead of this epidemic with lifestyle change, you can make a difference. I think industry is getting that, and they're getting it in a variety of different ways. And so you hope that industry is putting, in a sense, pressure on government to think differently about this, because like, we don't have the benefit of top-down. So you both have to go after elected officials and make them aware and get them competing with each other, but then also you have to harness sort of industry and the marketplace to try to bring some pressure to bear as well.
To move it. And have you seen the same, David?
Same thing. I would really say that I think the private development sector really is getting the message about smart growth and sustainable development and the kinds of things that we can document through geodesign. There's both the supply issue that particularly in California and our other urbanized areas, there's just not the land available anymore, both physically and through policy. We don't have the land available to do the kind of sprawl development we did. And the market is shifting. People want a different housing type. And so the development community is getting that. And I see the geospatial design, the geodesign that we're doing really as a tool to help developers. We're using this tool in our offices to help developers identify appropriate sites to consider for new development. We're using it as a tool, as I showed, to do analyses in all our projects, and we're using it as a way to move the market to really illustrate for policymakers and the developers what some of the potential is. So, you know, we can go and map the walk score, we can map proximity to transit, we can map proximity to other services, and those are big selling points for the development community.
Yeah. So we're in Esri, and I guess one question I'd love to hear from both of you is, is there data that you wish you had that you don't have that could help your work proceed? For example, we don't have a national park layer.
Right.
Are there other data sets that you wish you had?
Well, and I know because of the way that you do your analysis, for example, of walkability to parks,
Right.
If you don't get that data from the city, you risk the city saying you got it all wrong.
Right.
So you not only have to get the data from city by city, but then you've got to check it back with the city to make sure that you're being accurate. And frankly, if as you're trying, as we are, to put every American within a 10-minute walk of a park, we have to figure out how to do this wholesale. And so that data set would be really helpful, and one that everybody signed on to. And the other thing for us is, we've been looking at it from a quantity and access point of view. If we could have qualitative data, it's one thing to have a park, but if it's a park that's closed up or that is non-functional or the swing set's broken, that's not delivering quality of life in the way a well-tended park is. And to be able to actually get data, and maybe that's crowdsourcing, I'm not sure, but that would be enormously helpful too in the bigger picture.
Yeah. And I think, Will, that notion of crowdsourced data is very interesting, I think. I mean, I agree with you that to some degree we need to, in much of the work we do, we have to get data from our local client, because otherwise they suspect it of not being accurate. And at the same time, it would be great to have national databases, or at least statewide databases of many of these issues. California is trying to put together a host of layers, and we've had some pretty good success with those. We are able to get some data locally. We do a lot of ground truthing of it. The one piece of data we have a consistent problem with, that it would be great if Esri or someone else could help figure out a methodology, put it together, is health data, because of the confidentiality of it. And so we very much want to be able to map obesity, and we want to be able to map diabetes occurrences and other health outcomes. You can get that data at a very gross level by county or by zip code, but you can see from the analyses that we're doing and that Will's doing, that's really too gross a level to be meaningful at all. And it's very difficult to get access to that data because of federal law at any disaggregated level to be able to really use it in a meaningful way. So that's the big hole that we have. Everything else we can sort of, with enough resources, we can bootstrap a way to put it together, and it is important that it be ground truthed and that the locals really accept it. But health data can be hard to come by.
Yeah, there is a policy too. I mean, there's a political side to data. I mean, we're working with Columbia University on a post-Sandy study looking at the impact of protected wetlands on uplands, and we need the information on the economic damage that was done to those upland areas to really be able to do a cost-benefit assessment of, how and where to protect wetlands and how to engineer that. And we're not able to get that data because it's very politically sensitive.
And on that topic, it seems to me that both of your scores also reveal that there are real inequities of access to parks, to open space, to a whole set of factors. So how have the use of your scores changed the political conversation in communities about that inequality? Any
Absolutely.
examples?
I think that's one of the big benefits of doing this. And I think, geodesign and geospatial analyses have been one of several tools that really have changed the discourse over the last 15 years or so. That communities that formerly just really didn't care or very understand, perhaps, about disparities in access or disparities of the way we're making our cities now really can see those things. And seeing the maps is eye-opening for policymakers. And I think, Will sees this all the time. It's very hard to stand in front of of your public and say, well, I frankly don't care.
Yeah.
I see the map here, but it doesn't matter to me. And once the map is out there, they really have to turn around and make some changes.
Right.
But what's I think is interesting is that you have cities from a park system standpoint. You can say in New York, you can point to Central Park and you say, we've got some wonderful parks, Prospect Park, great Olmsted parks. But when you really do the analysis, you find out that so many neighborhoods have no parks whatsoever. And I think changing the dialogue away from saying, hey, we have some great parks and we have some signature parks, or we just created Millennium Park in Chicago, but move west from Lake Michigan and you find a lot of neighborhoods with nothing. And so I think changing the dialogue to say a healthy system isn't just about some great parks, it's about everybody having access. There's no better tool than these tools.
Yeah, and it's probably hard to raise money for parks in some of these neighborhoods, right?
Oh, absolutely. The city has to, government has to make that commitment.
Right, exactly. Well, let's engage our audience here. We ran out of time on our last session, but we do have quite a bit of time this session. So raise your hand. There are microphones, and you can either speak in the mic or I can also repeat your question. But Dan.
So I'm Dan Nadanichek from the University of Georgia, and I actually am going to throw out two questions that you may be able to split up. One is that there has been a lot of discussion about the so-called PCV farms, the abandoned developments that are out there as a consequence of the economic downturn. And in Georgia, there's been a discussion of red fields to green fields, the idea of perhaps reusing some of those places with some sound economic and financial analysis to get more of the sort of recreational land that you're talking about in place. So I was wondering what you all, both of you, think about that. And then the second question has to do, I guess, with cultural expectations related to recreation. And it's not always just that a park is close to people, but it has to be perhaps designed in a way that fits the particular culture that is likely to use that park. So those are the two questions that I thought perhaps you could discuss.
Great, thanks.
You want to start?
On the red fields to green fields, the big concept is after the recession, with so many not contaminated in terms necessarily of toxics, but contaminated financially. How can we take some of these properties that won't get developed for a long time and really convert them into public benefits and parks? And I think there are places where that's happening. There were some broad mechanisms proposed at the federal government, essentially another stimulus bill, that don't seem likely. So I think what's happening, though, is cities are taking up those opportunities on a place-by-place basis. But we do see contaminated property as land banked. To some extent, we're glad that it's contaminated because something else would have happened to it before, and now there's an opportunity to go back and at least use that potentially for recreation. I don't know how you are.
Well, and the kind of geospatial analyses that we do in GreenScore or ParkScore are certainly the kinds of analyses I think you all know you would want to do to identify which of those red field sites make the most sense to move forward. You are going to be looking at ownership patterns, but also at proximity to populations, at natural resources that exist on them, environmental constraints. All of those can be mapped geospatially. You can actually do it relatively quick and dirty using data sets that are available from other entities and get at least a gross level of analysis that would help you to identify the sites that are most important to move forward.
On your second question, there's another continuum there that I think is really important, and that is time. Because neighborhoods change, culture changes, uses change. Today's park with active recreation might be better redesigned for passive recreation or a place to picnic, 10 years from now. You know, Tom's hometown, you know, top of the list in park score at Minneapolis, fabulous park system, but the downtown was essentially commercial and industrial, was never envisioned as a place where a lot of people were going to live. People are moving back downtown, so now how do you actually repattern the downtown to add the parks and the open space that people are coming in from the suburbs demand? And so I think, you know, not only do you have to be responsive to the community that's there, but you actually have to recognize that over time, that's likely to change.
And from a geodesign perspective, of course, you can do analyses of demographics, types of population that exist in certain areas, understanding ethnicity, understanding age, understanding family type. Those are all going to be important inputs to think about the kind of park you want to build in an area, and certainly something we do in our office when our landscape architects start on a park design or do these studies for, say, Los Angeles County to try and fill in missing parks. They don't just say, where is the park needed, but they also say, what kind of park should it be based on the demographics that are there.
David, we heard from Will about how park score is really getting people to be competitive, but have you found GreenScore playing that same role where, because you're working at a slightly smaller scale than the whole city.
Right,
Has competition kicked in?
Well, and we're using the tool differently than Will's using it. I mean, one of the big differences between our two approaches, if you will, is that because we're working for individual clients who are typically public agencies and a more limited number of times are private developers, we're doing this on a case-by-case, project-by-project basis and almost never trying to make a tool that's more readily accessible to the public. And we would love to be doing that. It's just not something our clients generally want to do, or in the case of the public, they might not have the budget to do it. Very rarely we get a project where somebody says, and can you make this also have a graphic interface on the web that the public can get to, and we're really excited to do that. But I think we've probably done that with GreenScore about 3 times. And all the others have been internal analyses that we use. So that's really the big difference. So, but we see the policymakers in the individual cities taking this information and discussing it among themselves and discussing it on the dais and saying, you know, I've looked at these maps and we really need to do X, Y, and Z because we have neighborhoods that don't have good access to food. We have neighborhoods that don't have access to transit. We thought we were building this great transit system, but actually people can't get to it. These are the things they see, but they do it in their own city rather than that sort of public discourse that I think Will can speak to.
Exactly.
Yeah, and our goal again is to change the nature of cities and city planning and the value structure in this country to bring nature into the city and to give more people access. So we have to do it on the broadest wholesale level, which means you know, using a tool that we hope will get people's attention, namely a ranking tool, and then providing access to everyone so that they can get in there and poke around. Our challenge, you know, you take that to the extreme, is how do you do that for every city and every community, and then you bump into the data question that we were talking about earlier.
Good. I think we have a question over here. Yes.
Thank you. My name's Christine Sidaway. I'm a professor of geology at Colorado College in Colorado Springs. That's a location that, as many know, has suffered from fire, flood, and threats to the quality of life that many of the citizens have experienced with surprise, as though they did not know that these sorts of impacts and costly events with damage could affect the urban environment. And it's in a time when the city governments have somewhat diminished economic resources, or potentially they have entrenched engineering solutions that exacerbate the problems. So applauding your efforts to use parks and urban design to promote individual health, that in these examples maybe has come to us through examples of recreation and increased abilities to address obesity, diabetes, medical problems that individuals might have. Could some of these examples also offer ways to engage citizens of the community as perhaps a workforce to enhance preparedness of cities for geological hazards and impacts of climate change, and to create an upswell of grassroots effort to put action teams into place when disasters occur?
It's kind of like a disaster score, right?
Yeah.
What do you?
Well, we've all, the word resiliency is, if anything, overused now, but we've talked about climate resiliency and environmental resiliency. A lot more people now are talking about social resiliency and how do communities pull together, in events like Katrina or Sandy. I mean, we've seen some pretty horrible examples of how cities and structure doesn't pull together. And I think it's a great question. We do a lot with participatory design and engaging communities, so that's sort of our window on how you build these networks. But the conversation is definitely being elevated, and I suspect we're going to see more and more of that. And I don't know what the answer is, nor who ultimately needs to take responsibility. Government should take responsibility, I would argue for that, but it almost seems like it's happening at a grassroots level where it is happening. I don't know where you're seeing it.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And here in California, we have a general plan requirement for something called a safety element, one chapter of the general plan that looks at all those issues in terms of the safety and the possible disaster planning. And geospatial maps and geodesign are very good tools to begin the process of looking at the places where there will be slope stability issues or earthquake issues, flooding, and so forth. And then every community actually does have a responsibility to have in their general plan an approach to dealing with each of those things. I would hope that we can even take the discourse one step further, which is to avoid those places from the beginning. I mean, we've got a history of developing, because it tends to be land that's cheap or it's owned by the people who happen to want to do development. We allow development in places where, frankly, it shouldn't have happened at all, where we have big landslide issues, where we're taking out sensitive resources, where we have noise from airports or all sorts of other things that we can actually map geospatially, that we can say to ourselves, this is a place with not one, but 3 or 4 or 8 different constraints on it, and really it wouldn't be good public policy to allow development there. It should remain as open space or agriculture or something else. And that's also what GreenScore and these other mapping suites can do, is to identify those areas and move the policy debate so that we don't see development happening in them.
Yeah. I mean, I know we have some representatives from the insurance industry, but I think they can drive some of this change, simply refusing to insure these properties.
Yeah, because the number of places, I mean, California and probably Colorado is the same, the number of places where houses get built on these half-acre lots surrounded by trees, and then people wonder, why are there more forest fires now than there were 20 or 30 years ago? It's kind of a no-brainer. It's because we're building in places that are actually very dangerous to build in from a fire perspective. And so we really just should get that mapping done and say to ourselves, these aren't good places to build.
Okay, I think we have a question over here, and then I'll get to you, Mike.
Okay, a quick question. I'm Peter Haig with the Nature Conservancy, and Will and I were actually talking a little bit beforehand. I think this is a good follow-on to the last question. It gets away from parks inside cities to some degree and talks about the ecosystem services out of systems that are serving cities in a larger landscape setting. And I think some of the models that you have are getting to that, but I'm wondering how you see that going forward. How do you see models coming forward that could incorporate ecosystem services and natural systems as it relates to sustainability specifically? And then also looking at more predictive modeling and how you see that. And I guess really the question is, not that it's happening, but in your experience, how do you see cities and mayors and council governments and agencies actually using it? Do you see kind of a shift at all, or do you think we're still a ways away from seeing that?
Wow. I mean, the answer to your last question, I think it's variable and depends on the sort of vision and leadership and the degree of leadership of mayors. And some get it and some don't, and some are dealing with other more pressing problems. There are cities where people are really focused on gun violence as opposed to their combined sewer overflows. We talked about park score outside the city limits. We do something called green printing, and I'm looking at Brees Robertson, who really runs all of these programs for us at the Trust for Public Land. But there we're looking, for example, we're doing a project right now in the North Trinity watershed north of Dallas and Fort Worth, really looking, as I know the Nature Conservancy has in a number of places, at the hydrology, at the importance of protecting feeder streams and buffer areas to actually protect water quality, which has an enormous impact on, at the very least, filtration costs, et cetera, when it comes into cities, if not the actual availability of water at all. And so I think more and more what goes on inside the city is really getting integrated with what goes on outside the city. Cities that are close to forest land, where there are catastrophic forest fires. The idea that a city might actually care about forest restoration within that watershed and do something about fuels to actually minimize the danger both to their water source but also to the city itself. I think that's becoming somewhat more common.
I don't know how much more I can add to that. I think one of the things I'm aware of, and you all I think are some of the forefront in it, is just geospatial mapping that does help you identify those areas that are most important for preservation in the outlying areas. So that can be done at any scale and in any environment. And I'm aware of it happening in the Amazon rainforest as well as here in the United States, where we're looking at a series of parameters, much like the kind of mapping I showed, and combining that mapping to identify those areas that would be highest priority for acquisition and preservation. I think that's another tool, another way of using these same tools that we're going to see more and more of. I do see a great change in policy making. I mean, in my career over 25 years, from when I started my career, the word sustainability, we hadn't actually started talking about sustainability. I can remember one of my colleagues coming to me and saying, they're now calling this sustainability, this thing we've been doing for the last 5 years. And that's to think that at the beginning of my career we didn't even have this word, and now it's something that at the very least I think every council member everywhere wants sustainability. They may have a different idea of what it is, but nobody's going to say I'm against sustainability, right? And so that's a pretty big change. And there are some cities that are at the local level that are a little bit kind of keeping their heads in the sand, but not too often. And even in those cities, there's a minority that has its head up looking around. So I think there's a huge change.
Yeah, great. Mike?
I wanted to push a little more on this notion of citizen involvement and through web tools and crowdsourcing, and ask, first of all, Will, but both of you, what would you see necessary in scaling up your work by an order of magnitude in the next couple of years? And how could you get the community folks that are interested in parks, that I've yet to work any place in the country or frankly the world where there wasn't at least one person very interested in the park system, how can we get those people participating in updating the data, but more importantly applying political pressure, showing up with the maps in the city council meetings, and driving this stuff, again, kind of an order of magnitude wider and deeper?
Yeah, I think the order of magnitude question is the good one, because there are efforts going on right now. I mean, there are already crowdsourced tools that people are using locally to actually report on the condition of their parks, but it's to get reliable data that the public can rely on and that the parks departments can rely on. I mean, the New York City Park Department, I know, has 3 people on their staff who do nothing but go visit parks, report on maintenance issues, et cetera, and report on them. To replace that with a reliable crowdsourced system, we're a ways away from that, and yet it would be enormously useful. And to an organization that is sort of moving from, place by place park design and development, working with the kids in schoolyards, et cetera, to saying, okay, our goal over the next 40 years is every American within a 10-minute walk of the park, means that we have to think about this entirely differently. It means we have to have a wholesale way of analyzing every city. So if a mayor comes and you say, well, okay, how about me? How am I doing? You have to be able to answer that in a very cost-effective way. And then you also need to think about creating a social movement, which I think goes to your point that there are a huge number of people out there who care deeply about their parks and their park systems. Figuring out how you mobilize those folks with apps or a cohesive movement that doesn't require a huge amount of investment in staff, et cetera, I think it's a great question. It's one we're going to have to answer.
I think one of the other unfortunate things is, particularly when you move away from parks and into wider issues of sustainability and good urban design, it becomes more and more esoteric and more something that doesn't necessarily grab people's attention. So people may be generally in favor of it, but the number of people who come out against bus rapid transit in their neighborhood is unfortunately much higher than the number of people who come out in favor of bus rapid transit in their neighborhood. Even though most people probably want bus rapid transit, it's the naysayers who, it's that 10 or 15% of the people who drive the debate who tend to not like change, even though 85% of the people are very interested in seeing the change. So I'm very interested in seeing tools be developed, and it's not probably going to be by us because we're working on the public the objective consultancy side, but it would be great if there were tools available coming from the NGO side where people could say, I'm here on my app, I'm going to tell you, I do want bus rapid transit, I do want sustainable development, I do want transit-oriented development, and I'm in favor of that. That would be a great tool to have. The other thing we are doing, going back to the other point about data collection, I think there's a big problem in data collection and really considering it to be data when it's crowdsourced reported. But if it's just opinion, that can be much more profound. And I think that's something we are now able more and more to collect in a meaningful way. We're developing apps for our clients where a person can log on to the general plan app and report an idea when they're out in the field. They're driving around their city or walking around their city, they take a photo, the phone knows where they are, they report that, and that becomes a piece of input into the process. You can't necessarily take it as gospel data that now I'm going to send out a crew to fix that problem, but you're at least getting ideas of people's opinion as the planning process moves forward, and I think that's very strong.
You know, you raise a really good point about how do you know, people care about parks, they care about nature, they care about getting outdoors. They don't care so much about, you know, hydrology.
Right.
You know, so how do you engage them in those issues? Sometimes you can use parks or whatever as an entry point. We're in our Green Schoolyard program in Manhattan. We actually use a tool developed by the Center for Neighborhood Technology called Sewer in a Suitcase. And so we'd go into the classrooms, and the kids are involved actually in redesigning their playgrounds, but you'd go in and it's actually a model schoolyard and everything, and you pour water onto it, and you actually get to see where the water goes, and they begin to understand, aha, there's an issue with rain and stormwater, and we could actually have our playground participate in mitigating the problem that we have in the city. So I think you have to start them young, and you have to figure out different ways to engage them. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to make informed decisions around complexity.
Yeah, great. Do we have other? Yes, go ahead.
My name is Hamid Azhan. I'm Director of Planning and Design at Cal State University San Bernardino. I know one city had a very beautiful park, and we're talking about parks, and the park has been closed by the city. And I heard the main reason was probably financial, but another reason was that homeless people were using the park. So as we all know, probably homeless people need the parks more than any other people. But city officials become discouraged of this. So has Geodesign has a solution for that?
I'll let you take that one.
Yeah.
I don't know that there's a geodesign solution to it. It's a big public policy issue, of course, and there is, in some circles, there's a movement towards the ongoing constant privatization of space in order to keep certain elements out. When a space is public, both publicly accessible or publicly owned, there is an idea that anyone can use it, and the homeless are part of anyone. If we close all our public spaces, if we, there's an attitude, we see it sometimes even about sidewalks. Well, we shouldn't have sidewalks here, we're just going to have people sitting on them. We shouldn't have street trees, they're just going to obscure the buildings. I mean, this mentality, pretty soon you end up with absolutely nothing in the public realm. I do think that the geodesign and geospatial maps that we put together that are primarily analytical tools and the input that we can get from the apps we're talking about, those can all be things that help to move that policy discourse back towards an idea that actually there are contravening benefits to having public space, and that even though you might have an issue with homeless people in your park, there are other ways to address that rather than closing the park altogether. And it's true, closing the park altogether is a way of getting rid of that problem, but I think they call that throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It's closing the park to solve a very specific problem, and that's not the right way to do it from a policy perspective. I think our maps and our analyses can help to show that there are other really important reasons to keep the park open.
I did some research with a grad student where we mapped the homeless in our city, and this was a revealing thing to the city. They had no idea what the daily life of a homeless person was, and showed them that there were actually ways to accommodate the homeless other than having them sleep in the park, or in Minneapolis, they often sleep in the library. They congregate there. And so by mapping the invisible populations in our communities, it can reveal a lot and drive a lot of discourse. So we're not blaming the park for other kinds of service problems, which seems to be what's happening in your community.
No, I just think that societal challenges tend to show up in the public realm, and that's what this problem is.
Right.
And closing off the public realm doesn't solve societal problems.
Right. Do we have over here? Okay,
So
I'm sorry.
I'm David Tulloch from Rutgers University, and we've actually been doing a lot of the mapping of both the physical activity environment and the food environment, working with public health professionals at our school, as well as coming from our design and GIS programs. And one of the things that we found that really surprised the public health professionals, once we also mapped kids and their BMIs and compared those factors, something that may not surprise a lot of the planning and design members of the audience, was that what had been published in the literature in the past, particularly from your city, in Minneapolis, but also in Seattle and elsewhere, didn't turn out to be true in our cities. Different factors, we use our mass transit different, we use our sidewalks differently. Maybe we use our parks at different times of the year than Seattle. There could be a lot of different factors, but we were finding the relationships to be somewhat different than in other types of cities. And so my first question is, are either of you thinking about the different ways that different cities behave as a change in how these ideas play out?
Can I ask you, are you saying you found weaker correlations between presence of parks or access to food and good health?
Different correlations, yes.
Well, can you
so
say
we did
what
find the
different means?
the half mile to a park was consistent. But for instance, the role the supermarket played was less important. The role that fast food, convenience stores played was more important. And again, my public health colleagues were sort of surprised because these seemed like they should be universal truths. If it's true in Seattle and Minneapolis, it must be true in places like Newark and Camden and Trenton.
Right. So climate, culture, all kinds of other factors are affecting these.
They do.
Yeah.
As geodesigners, I'm just wondering, as we start trying to, I'd love to see this scaled up nationally, but it raises that question, if Miami's different than Newark, how do we take those into account?
Well, our challenge, I think, as a national organization is how do you act, how do you think globally and act locally? Right. And I think you really have to take each city and each population where you find it. And if you're doing a lot of listening, we used to think a lot of our green printing process, we used to think was mostly about mapping. We got all excited about the mapping and what you could do with the maps. And then we ultimately found out it was really about listening. And if you really listen, those differences come out, and then they are reflected in how you design parks, how you think about access, how you look at different communities and how they're going to use parks.
And I'll go out on a limb here and may get in trouble and say I'm not sure that there are such big differences as you're saying, because I'm not sure that what you're reporting from Minneapolis and Seattle that we can take to be truth about anything everywhere, and maybe not even in Minneapolis and Seattle. There's been so little of this work actually done to really know the correlation between some of these physical attributes like access to food and the health outcomes that I think we need to do it a lot more before we're really going to know something for sure. Certainly a lot of the work we've done, we've found some of the same things that you just said, that is that access to parks makes a pretty big difference in health outcomes. Not having a preponderance of unhealthy food makes a somewhat noticeable correlation. Having access to a grocery store may or may not be correlated. We've seen that in many of the studies we've done too. So I think that we're going to need to do this some more. The other thing I say to people when they say, well, but you can't prove this correlation, I say, well, but that doesn't mean it's not important to do. It just goes without saying that even though you can't show a correlation that people are healthier when they have access to food, and healthy food, that doesn't mean therefore we shouldn't give them access to healthy food. It's a basic fundamental right that people need access to healthy food, and it's just common sense that if you put fresh produce into the corner stores, as is happening now through a number of health initiatives in a number of our cities, you're going to have people more likely to buy that food. And we don't need to do a huge study to show BMI outcomes before we should get people able to buy a carrot at their corner grocery store.
So if I could follow up then, because that's exactly linked to the second question I wanted to ask, which is, and this plagues, I think, all the geodesign issues that we've seen for the last several years here, the science isn't ready yet, but we need to act as soon as we can. You must, and especially Will, you must deal with this all the time. When, you know, it take 10 years to do an ecological study, but the land's available now. How do you guys deal with the uncertainty when you need to make those decisions?
As best you can. Seriously, I mean, I think, you know, if there were one, you know, you asked earlier about what data we'd like, you know, impact data would be great. You know, truly being able to value ecological services. I mean, a lot has been done in that, but we don't have it yet. And in the absence of that, you make your best guess. And you try to make other cases, and sometimes people actually don't even care about what they should mostly care about in a decision. It's something that you think might be irrelevant that appeals to them. So it's, the arguments vary, and we are, to some extent, data-starved, particularly around impacts and valuation.
I think this is also, it's a question of discipline, that is the discipline from which one comes or where one's trained. You know, I'm trained as a planner and an architect, and one of the very clunky slogans we have in my office is that planning is thinking about places and doing something about them. Which I hate that slogan. It's totally like, what does that mean? But it does point to your question that we're trained as planners to do something about it, whether we really are ready or not. And we do hire technical experts. We hire biologists. We hire geologists. They'll often come back to us and say, the data's not really very reliable. You should do another study. And our answer is, well, we can't actually do another study anymore. We're out of money. We're out of time. We're going to have to make a policy decision based on the best available data right now. And so then we help our policymakers to go ahead and make that decision, even though we have to admit that we don't have all the data. And our experts are telling us, we wish we could do another study, but we just can't do that next study, and we have to move forward anyway.
Right. Yes. Do we have another question here? I think that, I mean, to me, this gets at really the issue of why combining design and GIS is so powerful.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
the scientific method is one of studying and often leads to other studies,
Right.
while design and planning is about acting, and then you learn from that action in an iterative way.
Right.
And I think the sense, certainly in this audience and the things we've heard about this morning, we don't have time to continue to study these issues.
Right.
We've got to act and then learn from our actions.
Yeah.
So.
And we're going to act as best we can, and we're going to learn from those things.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Well, let me ask one final question. Both of you are incredibly successful in what you've been doing, but what are some of the obstacles that you face in terms of either on the nonprofit side or running a planning firm? What are some of the challenges?
Money.
Okay.
From a nonprofit standpoint, you know, you want to scale up, you want to increase your impact, and that means more resources with which to work, and we're all facing different kinds of challenges. We have one window on it. We're certainly aware that the solutions need to be holistic, but we're looking at, you know, at parks and open space and connecting people with nature, and we recognize the value of the other social goods with which we're competing, whether it's education or safety or you name it. And so I think just getting from a nonprofit standpoint, just getting the resources is one thing. And then the second I would say is the current remarkable dysfunction and disconnect in our elected officials who seem to be totally out of touch with their constituencies. It'd be one thing if the constituencies were totally crazy, but oftentimes we find that when we poll and go to an elected official, they say, "Oh, I had no idea." So I think the need to educate our leadership around a different way of thinking about things is huge, and it's just very, very difficult to do because people are so set in their ways and have effectively a very dysfunctional approach to things.
Yeah, ideologies. Yeah.
Yep.
I was going to say pretty much exactly the same two things. I'll say one of them almost exactly the same way, which is that resources are always a big issue for us. Money, and I think honestly the nonprofit sector sometimes is actually better funded than some of our clients in the public sector, where there's just really very limited revenues today. And it would be great to be able to both do additional geospatial analyses, additional geodesign, and additional interactive tools that the lay public can use. And we just typically don't have the resources to do them, even less, I think, than some of the, we see great tools coming out of your organization, from the Nature Conservancy, from CNT. You all are, I think, to a large degree, the leaders, even more than we're seeing from the public sector. But resources are clearly an issue. On the second issue you talked about, Will, I totally agree with you. I'd put it in a slightly different way, which is, to me, it's the problem of the great middle, which I talked about a little bit before, that the middle of the public doesn't drive the decision-making very often, particularly not at the local level. And what drives the local decision makers is this 10 or 15% outliers on either end of the bell curve who have a very extreme point of view, often don't want anything to change, and they're the ones who the elected officials listen to, because they're the ones who'll go out and walk the precincts. They're the ones who call up their city council members. They're the ones who tell their 10 friends whom to vote for. A lot of those normal people may not even know the policies of the people they voted for city council, but they voted for them because somebody they sort of respect told them that those are the ones to vote for. So I think that as we move this forward, the more that we can use crowdsourcing and the more we can take these tools to make a more democratic process where people really, where it's easy for them to give an opinion, and then the decision makers can easily hear what 70 or 80% of their constituents believe, that's going to make a huge difference in driving policy decisions.
Great point.
Great.